Hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to see you today. My name is Dustin Cormier, and we're watching How to Rock Astrology. In today's episode, I'm very excited to be bringing my friend Laura Barat of laurabaratastrologer.com here to hang out with me today and talk a little bit about the three very well used and the real new age sort of movement that's happening in Tropical Vedic Astrology, where we introduce and intricately bring together Parashara, Jaimini, and the cards of truth. So thank you so much for hanging out with me today, Laura.
Thank you for having me.
I'm very, very excited for you to be hanging out with me.
Yeah, me too.
So for everybody watching, I've invited Laura here today specifically to talk about the chart of Pablo Picasso. Pablo Picasso was a late 19th century artist who lived in Spain and made huge waves in the world with his art, and also got famous, well-known, and even wealthy in his time. So this is one of the reasons why I'm glad that we're talking about Pablo Picasso, because many of these things, including whether you're really going to gain wealth, whether you're, really showing what can be expected from the personality given in Parashara, these are the things we see in Jaimini, I think, in a lot of ways. I've often considered that Parashara kind of underlines some tendencies in the personality, in the psyche. And Jaimini really, in a lot of ways, can show what's expected to happen with the tendencies of the psyche. And Jaimini is a little bit more to the bones in this way of the physical, tangible things that we can expect to see.
Yes. Yes.
Would you say you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. Jaimini is really, really adept astrological techniques at ascertaining the talents, and usually that translates into career, who the person marries, even some of the sicknesses, whether they'll be famous. There's also Jaimini yogas for wealth. So it's very concrete.
Concrete is definitely the word I would use. Very concrete and tangible things shown in Jaimini.
Yes.
Now, the third aspect of this conversation that we're going to probably talk about is we're going to talk about the cards of truth. Now, do you have a word on how the cards of truth can be defined in terms of these broad strokes that we're talking about right now? What does the cards of truth bring to a reading like this in a general way?
It just brings a lot more details and nuances because, there are 52 cards. So there's 52 different aspects of how phenomenon is expressed in the physical world, and what is expressed through the person based on the birth card and their spread. And it's also incorporates a Vedic numerology.
Right.
So the numerology is extremely important, married with the elements. So you have the numbers, and you also have the elements of fire, air, water, and earth expressed through numbers. So that's what's so nice about the cards of truth. And it's all based on nature, on things happening in nature. So it's a system in and of itself. It can be a separate system without any astrology, but then when you add the astrology, you really get a full picture, and a lot of concrete, predictions can be made from the birth chart or the birth spread and the yearly spread. And then it also divides the person's life into sections of 7 years. Right. So every 7 years, we go through a cycle.
A quadration, I believe, is the word I've heard for it.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And
cool.
We go through every 7 years, we kind of have a path we're walking, a theme of that 7 years that we encounter in the outside world. So, and it's it's really amazing how accurate it can be. It's just, and again, you don't even need the astrology for this. You can just look at the cards, but
No
adding the
kidding.
astrology
Brings a little
is very
extra something
helpful.
to it. Yes,
And
certainly.
those are the readings. The cards of truth readings are actually the longest readings. You know, you can go for 3 or 4 hours talking about the cards of truth.
No kidding.
Because then you have the astrology on top of it. So that's why it's so it takes such a long time.
So prolific.
Right.
So when you do a reading, would you typically talk about, you and I are building this presentation to go Parashara first, then Jaimini, then Cards of Truth. And that's just convenient for us in this presentation. Is that typically how a reading would go when you are trying to convey the Cards of Truth to somebody? Do you have to talk about the astrology first before mentioning the Cards of Truth?
Not really. I mean, you can just do the basics. I do, when I'm adding this, if I'm doing a card reading or Cards of Truth reading, I'll just talk about the basics, the karakas, the amakaraka, that's easy and really important. And then, of course, the Lajatati Avastas.
And that's critical for the Cards of Truth.
Yeah, you can really see that, and that's mainly what I talk about. And that's for the most part, I would say that's about 80% of the astrology that you use in the Cards of Truth is Lajatati Avastas and the karakas. The self factors. And then the career factors, and then the partnership factors, which is basically what most people want to know about. So
it makes sense to me, because I know that Ernst Wilhelm often talks about how very direly critical to a reading the Lajatati Avastas are. And I do find myself sometimes wanting for how I can convey this to the personal experience of a person that I'm trying to talk about a Lajatati Avasta with. When you see that the sun is being starved by Saturn and vice versa with some kind of combination there, it's one thing to tell a person that. It's another thing to convey where in their personal experience they will see it manifesting. And I guess that the Cards of Truth gives a little bit more information in this regard.
Exactly, especially in what card that's happening.
No kidding. So the card, I'm noticing, we'll talk about the Cards of Truth when we get there, and I'm very excited to. But thank you, Laura. That gives us a good little glimpse of what we're dealing with today. So for everybody watching, this is our intention today. Now, I probably should have done this a little moment earlier, story of my life. For everybody watching, I'd like to just mention, of course, Laura Barat is a student of Ernst Wilhelm. You're one of the first students who went to online and really started to be a passionate contributor to the movement of Tropical Vedic Astrology. We have a bit of a debt to you, Laura, for the work that you've done and just believing in the truth that you're putting out there.
Thank you.
It's very important in any days in astrology where things are not changing, but we are catching on to different ways of understanding it. So it's important
very rapidly.
Yeah, it's the information age is really bringing some fun things. Now, for everybody interested, if you watch this video and you are enjoying what Laura is putting down, you can find Laura at her website, laurabaratastrologer.com. And that's Laura, LauraBarat, astrologer.com. I'll probably put a little thing so that people can see it. Laura has been doing this for a long time. You actually have a book published. It's called Grahas as Karakas. Karakas. And this is based on Parashara, this book. So for anybody who's interested, you can start to see a little bit of where Laura is getting at with her own personal books, which you can find on her website. She works with all types of astrology, and that's counseling. And of course, you're still doing readings, Laura. Is that correct? Just so
I am, yes.
Yes. So, and you'll do
sometimes
readings.
I take breaks.
Yes.
Yeah.
Believe me, I understand that. So if anybody wants to get a hold of you, I suppose they can go through your website and contact you that way for a reading. Is that correct?
Yes, definitely.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So it's very awesome for me to be hanging out with a fellow tropical Vedic astrologer. And I'm very glad that everybody can see you doing your stuff on my channel today.
Okay.
So the plan me and Laura kind of had set up is that we would talk a little bit first about Parashara. And it's the grounding of Parashara, which is really what I've been studying with Asheville Vedic Astrology for the most part. I should like to mention that, and Laura, I'd almost like to see if you get where my consciousness is at here. I've been building this image in my head, just more of a placeholder so that my Western audience can understand Parashara and Jaimini and the difference. I often consider Parashara to be almost the Plato to Jaimini's Aristotle. Parashara is, in fact, many of the things that we find in Jaimini, we actually see in the writings of Parashara. Mm-hmm. Really, Parashara kind of is, as in Plato, he kind of is the beginning patriarch of the foundation of astrology. Jaimini is kind of like Aristotle. He took what Parashara had laid down and really came into his very own unique expression of a very different type of astrology. Would you say it's correct to kind of say that Jaimini is coming out of the bones of Parashara?
Well, it's really hard to tell because, all right, so yes, historically, they don't really know. There's some people who do believe that Jaimini was a student of Parashara, and then some people who believe the vice versa.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, and then a lot of the things in Parashara that just reiterate Jaimini yogas. Mm-hmm. Some of those things are believed to be corrupted, or they were added in later on and embellished, because Jaimini is, if you read Jaimini, he's extremely cryptic, and he only says very, very few words. So it's really difficult to understand what he's trying to say. He just gives you a sentence, but he doesn't tell you how to get there. And later on in Parashara, I think things were added that were trying to explain or what they thought he was trying to say.
So it's probably better to say that Jaimini has the most real accurate sutras when it comes to the literature that is conveyed through the Jaimini school. Whereas
yes, I absolutely believe that to be
I
true.
Understand. I certainly understand. And so Parashara is kind of this etymological question mark or an anthropological question mark where many people have just chucked their contributions, thinking passionately that they're trying to convey what was given in the deep roots of sutras like Jaimini. But that passion is often rajasic, and that passion is often expressed as, this person trying to be a clever commentator more than them trying to be an accurate representation of what's being said in the sutras.
Right. A lot of the sutras in Parashara that are attributed to Jaimini astrology probably weren't even written by Parashara.
Wonderful.
They were probably added on later in the Middle Ages, quote unquote. But and the systems too, there's a lot of the same things. There are some synchronicities, but the systems are completely different. Right. And the Jaimini system was so obscure, and it's just actually coming out and coming into consciousness in the worldly, knowledge. And Jaimini, for me, and I think for Ernst as well, I'm not really sure what he thinks about it. And from what he said, I kind of get that he thinks this way as well. But Jaimini is the foundation, like the bare bones,
Right.
like you were saying. It gives you the tools from which everything else can be explained. And like his description of the signs is very basic, but if you have to contemplate what he's saying, and then you start to understand what he's trying to convey.
A favorite
And
word
then,
that I think of is enigmatic.
yeah,
It's because it's
yeah,
not, he's not
definitely.
giving you the answer per
No,
se.
he
He's
is
giving you
not.
the tools to cognize the energy.
Yeah, like he'll say for Taurus, he'll say quadrupeds. That's the only thing he says for Taurus.
No
And
kidding.
yeah, quadrupeds. So what does that mean? Well, it means wealth. In the old days, that meant wealth. If you had a lot of animals, you were wealthy and your life was easier. Okay,
Right.
because you could ride on your horse or whatever, and you had cows and all that stuff. But it also means other things. If you think about what quadrupeds are,
Certainly. And that you
and,
had
and and
just
you just start getting all of these ideas, then you really start to understand what Taurus really means.
right. So
And
those,
then, yeah, so
thank you, Laura. So those Jaimini sutras that are given there are, I'm starting to turn my consciousness towards the deepest sutras. I almost see Jaimini as really being the heart of the chart in the way, in a way. But a
yes, I
heart,
agree.
right.
Mhm.
And so a heart is contained in a human body that has feet, that has a head. And, the pulse of your heart is in your feet, it is in your whole body. So, in the same way that Jaimini really is the heart of astrology, you need to access that heart through all the other things given in astrology. Really, the Jaimini heart that we're talking about, it stands alone on its own. And that's how I'm beginning to understand it. Jaimini really is that crown of what can be, at least what's given anthropologically in sutras and in scriptures.
Mhm.
And it's a good thing to be able to think of it that way.
Yeah.
So, as we go on, it's important for us to consider that what we're going to be pushing towards in our Jaimini reading is the heart of the reading. I just think it's useful for us to dig first into Parashara to show the difference between what's given in Parashara and then to glorify that Jaimini heart in the second section of our reading. So that is my plan for today, Laura. Now,
Okay.
I've got my notes in front of me. I think we've given a good introduction. I'm ready to start rocking and rolling if you are, Laura.
Okay, I'll share my screen
Please do.
here.
Wonderful. So here we can see this must be Kala software.
Yes.
Wonderful. And yours looks very pretty. It looks a little bit different from mine. I guess different computers just
Oh,
enliven it in
really?
different ways. Yeah.
What's different?
Well, if you look at mine, like the color is a bit more orange and beige rather than this nice yellow that you have going on. That's the only way
Oh,
I can
okay.
describe it. Software things, really. Okay,
Yeah.
Laura. Now, where we kind of are at here is that, I've got my notes of what we can talk about in terms of Parashara.
Okay.
Is there anything that you would like to start with? If you were to do a typical reading of the Parashara sort, I mentioned I often kind of start off with the big three, and especially we could talk about the rising sign Lord, the sun.
Okay, let's start there then. Yeah.
Sure. Alrighty. Now, the first thing that I kind of wanted to just mention that I saw with regards to the sun, one of the things I've written is right off the bat, I've noticed that the sun is his weakest planet in terms of Shadbala. When we look at the Shadbala, thank you very much for bringing it up there, Laura, we'll notice that the percent of what's required for Picasso to express his sun is at 70% of what's required. Probably one of the biggest factors in this is that the sun is in the fourth house, and it's very close to the fourth house cusp.
Right.
Which probably does a lot to the Digbala. And Digbala is really what is often considered has to do with hearing the planet, trying to absorb the energies of the planet from within inside yourself.
That's true. Yeah.
Having extremely low dig bala might show us that for all the creative capacity that Pablo Picasso might have had, really just any self orientation will go through a little bit of resistance internally. It's something that he has to learn to build, and really he has to live with the fact that he might not be inclined to use his first house as powerfully as we might expect. Now, this sun is in the 4th house. It's in the sign of Scorpio, and in the sign of Scorpio, that'd typically be friendly. Although we can see that Mars is far enough away that the sun's actual dignity is probably neutral by being in Scorpio in the sign of a temporary enemy.
That's right.
Thank you. So the sun is neutral there. As well, what I also wanted to note in terms of thank you for bringing this up here, Laura. In terms of the prosperity of the 1st house, we can see already that the sun is Mrita. It is considered to be of old age, and this gives the sun a little bit more difficulty in trying to apprehend what it needs to do for its ruling house, and that's the 1st house. So we can see a little bit of a tired sun here, tired first lord. By being in Svapna, Jagradadi Avashta, that's neutral, and it's not as bad as it could be. We see that the sun here, it does have one positive Rashi aspect by Venus. By Venus being in Libra, the sign of Leo is gaining a little bit of extra power from the benefic Venus. And I think that this does help this 1st house to have what it needs. Usually when Venus is Rashi aspecting a Rashi in a house, I usually typically consider this to mean that someone in the family or in relationships or one's mother, one's aunts might have been encouraging to the 1st house.
That's very true in his case.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Very good. So Picasso would have had a little bit of, this is the 1st house we're talking about. So it's like, come on, honey, you can do it. Whatever it is, anything in life, to be able to be encouraged in your 1st house gives you the ability to kind of really initiate the path that you want to move forward in life. Now, the sun having really all these difficulties, it's Mrita, it's Svapna, it's in neutral dignity, and it's really pretty low in its Shadbala. The one thing that this sun does have, it's kind of really neutral in terms of the Lajatadi Avashtas. If you don't mind, if you'd like to just show a quick picture of the Lajatadi Avashtas of the planets there, Laura. Thank you very kindly. We can see that the sun is being given some strength by its friend Mars, and also a little bit from Jupiter, who's opposite. The only damaging thing to the sun is that Saturn is starving it a little bit. The Saturn is starving it at 46 points of Drishti Yuti.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the fact that Saturn is making the sun struggle a little bit is adding up to this idea that this sun and this 1st lord has a little bit of struggle, again, trying to initiate its action and do what it wants to in its path in life. And that is really a big thing of what I wanted to describe about the sun. The only thing, the one thing that I did want to say is that this sun has some capacity, because in the D60 chart, Laura, I noted that the sun that's given is it's exalted in Aries in the D60 chart. This is one thing that I thought might be interesting to bring about as well. Thanks for just showing that there, Laura. So we can see the sun is with Jupiter in Aries in the D60 chart. I usually tend to consider the D60 as being really the limits or the root potentials of what can be seen in the rest of the different charts and the rest of the different Vargas. By being exalted in Aries, this sun does have a little bit of capacity at its bones to move forward with what it has to do. And, despite all the difficulties we see in the Shadbala, in the starvation from Saturn, and by being Svapna of Ashta and Mrita of Ashta, it does have at least a deep germ of being able to express in an exalted state. And this is typical of astrology. We see many positive indications and negative indications, but overall, I think that this sun does have to move through a little bit of difficulty in doing what it wants to do. I would like to check out the Navamsha if you wouldn't mind there, Laura. The Navamsha, what is the last thing I was going to say about the sun? Because in the Navamsha chart, do you mind just taking a quick peek at the Navamsha there, Laura?
Oh, yeah. Hold it up here.
Oh, thank you very much, Laura. You're really on it here, and I appreciate you looking things up. We can see in the Navamsha here, the D9 chart, Jupiter is in the sign of Leo. And that for me is making me think that, at least in terms of the soul, there is some support through Jupiter here in bringing out what the sun is trying to do in Pablo Picasso's chart. Really by that Jupiter being in that 5th sign of Leo, which is the 5th from the Navamsha Lagna. Leo is the natural 5th sign, and Jupiter being here will bring a little bit of positivity to Pablo Picasso's sense of creativity, his capacity to lead from inside himself and push himself towards the life, being a progressive, creative person that he wants to be. So this is the one thing that I wanted to kind of talk about in terms of the sun. Now, I don't want to be too scattered here, Laura. And with what I was just, where I'm going with this is that I wanted to talk a little bit about the sun first. Now, the sun being in the position that it is, it has some overall capacities to do what it needs to do. But I think it has a little bit of struggle by being in that 4th house. And it has a little bit of, it's given some strength by being with Mercury here. It gives a little bit of capacity to research and to learn about what it needs to do to express itself as the sun. Is there anything that you wanted to mention in terms of everything that I've just mentioned in terms of Pablo Picasso's sun, Laura?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, please feel free.
All right. So as far as like Digbala goes, having the sun in the 4th, when planets are in the opposite of their Digbala, it usually means that that planet cannot lead you to happiness in the direction of expressing its natural indications, meaning that his career and what he was doing wasn't actually going to give him happiness, or it wasn't going to, I shouldn't say happiness, that's the wrong word. It wasn't going to give him the feeling of being accomplished and having power and influence, which is what the sun wants to do. That's the natural indication of the sun, is to build a kingdom and wield power and influence through that kingdom. And even though that is something, he became very famous and wealthy, it didn't make him feel like he was. And that is actually very prevalent in his life, because he was someone who was, he was very temperamental. He had a lot of problems in his personal life. And he was always at odds with authority. That's another thing that the sun rules. He was very afraid of the French police.
No kidding.
Because they arrested him at one point. He was having all these conflicts with authority. And so that also, the sun was not helping him in the indications of his sun. So that's what happens when a planet has no Digbala. Dig means directional. So that planet is designed to lead you in a direction. a certain direction. And if it doesn't have it, it's not going to do that for you.
Right, certainly. And it still has all the energy trying to express itself through that fourth house. Even the malefic sun being in the fourth does say something about his difficulty in personal. It's almost as if he tried to get the experience of the fulfillment of his career and of feeling like his establishing his kingdom through the fourth house, which is subjective experiences, which is the sun is a hot thing to try and fit into that fourth house experience.
Right. Yeah, it is very much so. And then of course, in the Shad Bala, I'm going to bring that up again. I usually, when I look at the percentage of required or the ranking down here, I mainly look at this. I look at Shad Bala in the individual strengths.
Good.
So like Sthana Bala is the stance, Kala Bala is the time strength, Cheshta Bala is the confidence. But when you look at down here at the percentage, if it does not meet 100%, that usually shows up as health problems.
Especially for the sun or for any planet?
So if the sun is really weak, then usually the person will have heart problems, or they'll have immune problems, immunity system problems, or arthritis and weak bone problems.
Because they're not called to move in a direction that would vitalize those things that the sun needs.
Well, yeah, the Digbala is just one strength.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Laura.
Oh, no worries. All of these strengths added together shows the overall power behind that planet. And if that planet doesn't, it usually manifests in the health using all of these balas or all of these strengths.
Right.
But each strength of 4 is like telling you something on its own. And so that's how I use the Shad Bala mainly.
Right. And we could go through all these because each one of these is weak in this chart.
Yeah. The sun is very weak. That's for sure.
No kidding.
Because it's got low Digbala and it's very close to its debilitated position.
Certainly.
But then as far as like the sun being exalted in the D60, that's great. That's wonderful. The D60 always qualifies everything. And the D60 is a 12th house Varga. It's a derivative of the 12th house. And the 12th house always shows the outcome. It shows it's like the very last filter that everything has to filter through. And so what's really important in the D60 is to show the outcome of things.
I see.
So the outcome of his career and the outcome of his power and influence was amazing.
Ultimately outstanding.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Now, would we say that he ultimately at some part of his life would have caught on that he did actually do what he was kind of supposed to do in his life because it's given in that D60? Because you mentioned that he did very well in his career, but his internal experience was not always reflective of that. Would the D60 help us to make us think that by the end of his life, maybe he didn't feel so bad about it, or maybe he was more satisfied than the lack of Shad Bala might convey?
Right. I think he was more satisfied with that. Yes. But not as much as he would have been if that sun was in a better position.
Right.
So, but the actual concrete outcome of his career was fantastic. And that shows in this, it really does show, especially because Jupiter is with the sun, and Jupiter is a manifested, I'm getting into Jaimini now.
Right. That's okay.
Yeah, I'll just skip that.
Well, that's okay, but that's still useful for us to consider.
Yeah, Jupiter and Mercury are manifesting planets. And when they conjoin or Rashi aspect something, they will manifest that planet very strongly.
Right.
And they're both hitting his sun, in addition to it being exalted.
Right.
So the outcome was a legacy. Again, the sun also rules consistency and
Mhm.
legacy. And the sign of Leo is consistency, being consistent in something. He was consistent
Okay.
a
Of
lot in
course.
his artwork.
Mm.
But notice how, because the sun is not in Digbala, or it's the opposite, he completely changed his art. He went through different periods. Like he went through the blue period, he went through
And
the
then
pink
the
period,
Cubism periods, and then the
Cubism,
African
and
periods.
yeah, and before he was painting like, the Renaissance masters, and then he
Right.
totally changed his style. So he wasn't consistent, but in a way he was.
Mm,
It was
very
always an art,
interesting.
but he really changed his styles quite a bit. And then
Hmm.
oh, and another thing, the sun in Cancer.
Right.
Okay, so the Navamsha is really a chart of Dharma.
Hmm.
It's like, how happy are we on the path we're walking in life? How satisfied do we feel about where we are?
Hmm.
And so the sun actually does really well in Cancer. The moon is a
Yes.
friend to the sun. Cancer, Jaimini says, Cancer is a faraway place. So
Mm.
Cancer rules foreign countries.
Oh, interesting in terms of
Yeah,
Picasso.
that's a huge one. And nobody knows this except if you take Jaimini.
Cool.
But what I'm trying to point out here is he became famous. He actually got his fame and wealth in France, not in Spain.
Right. Right. Right.
And he
Right.
lived most of his life in France. So he was in a foreign country.
Right.
And
Certainly. And go ahead.
his fame and wealth all came from French society.
Hmm.
So that's really interesting in that
Yeah, and then
regard.
I suppose it's interesting too that maybe if he had a better digbala, maybe if he had better positions of his sun generally, we could see that the sun is doing well in the Navamsha by being in Cancer. He is doing well, really, in these other places, in these foreign places.
Mhm.
Ultimately, if he had better Rashi chart expression of the sun, he would have really been an established kingdom in France. Ultimately, he did great in France, and that was part of his grandeur. But he probably would have been a respected person in France as, like, somebody who would have really owned his identity as in the French world, which maybe he had less capacity to do because of the sun being uh, weak in the way that we've talked about it.
Right. Yeah, very much so. And then he had some temperamental problems, and um, problems with temper and women, just
Mm-hmm.
he had a lot of issues that he had to work out. And
Certainly.
that can also show a sun that is afflicted in a
Mm-hmm.
man's chart, because he doesn't feel like he's expressing his initiative and his power and influence the way he
Mm,
wants to.
right, which is important for the male erotic ego.
Right, right. But another thing too is the sun is actually, or sun and Mercury conjunctions are Buddha Aditya yoga, which makes the person highly skillful. It's a
Mm.
common thing because Mercury is never more than 60 degrees away from the sun. So it's you see that a lot with
Mhm.
just the sun and Mercury, but it does make a person extremely skillful.
No kidding.
Yeah, in whatever house it's falling in.
Right.
And oddly enough, the fourth house is the house of finished artwork,
Hmm.
like the painting or the sculpture that's finished.
Right. Really
And then the
completing it.
fifth house cusp is creativity.
So being in the process of creatively trying to really finish a project.
Right, right. He had enormous creative potential. So that was highly expressed.
Cool. And Mercury really would have given him some of those extra skills and really the experimentability needed to proliferate ways of creatively completing projects and finding different ways of being able to complete projects. As an artist, for me, I often, sometimes it's a common thing for artists, is that you sit down to finish a song and you say, oops, instead I actually end up starting to write 3 new songs.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So it's an important thing to learn to diligently schedule times and places that force you to finish the song, to actually make the art piece.
Right.
And I think that he might have been meticulous about actually finishing projects, which is very cool.
Yep. Yeah, as far as I know, that's definitely true. So
now I think there's 2 points that I'd like to point at in terms of uncovering more that we can in terms of Parashara. I was thinking of speaking to the moon being conjunct Rahu. And then I was also thinking of moving towards the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter in the 10th house. Now, those are the 2 directions I'm moving. Laura, did you have anything else did you have anything else you wanted to add before we move there?
Oh, no, I was hoping you would talk about that.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Because we've already been talking about how really a very loaded sun here, because he's Leo rising. There's definitely a need for the self to build its foundation through what the sun is doing. And this is in the 4th house, which means he has to, by him kicking to make space for himself, he is probably going to be kicking the things in his personal life. It's almost like he's in a womb that he's trying to make space for his personal life. And this is the sun. It's a separating malefic agent. And this is in the 4th house, which is causing some personal life difficulties. Now, I think that this is going to be, really, I should say, this sun is exacerbating the theme of the 4th house and of the moon, which is already in a dire place. And the reason I'm saying that is because the moon is conjunct Rahu in that 5th sign of Sagittarius.
It's shamed, yes.
We would call that shamed. I was wondering if you would define that the same way. And so is this because it's
Rahu? Sorry, that's not.
Gotcha. So usually the moon would need to be with another malefic.
Well, the moon would need to be with Saturn, Mars, or the sun in the 5th.
Right, in the 5th.
Or it could be anywhere, any house, and it would have to be with Saturn or sun or Mars and a node. Right? So we wouldn't technically call this shame. No,
although
that's not shame.
It's interesting that the moon is with Rahu in the 5th house, but I think that I'm reading you on that, Laura. Generally, this does give the experience of the moon certainly being, it's in the 5th sign and it's leaning towards creativity. It's leaning towards wanting to be a creative planet, an enjoyable planet, and a romantic planet. The moon wants to establish its emotional wellness and its adaptability by its ability to sink into a creative, romantic mode. Now, by being with Rahu, of course, we know that Rahu is that signifier of untapped needs that the soul has not yet integrated. That's my way I'm sort of going about talking about Rahu. Now, I wonder if you could give us any insights into what you see from that moon being with Rahu in that sign of Sagittarius.
Oh, yeah. Well, moon with Rahu is the moon is how we adapt to our environment and how we adapt to, things in the world. And it's basically how we get our needs met. And when it's with Rahu, that part of our the moon is our personality. It's the jiva. It's how we take in information and our likes and dislikes, habits, all those things. That's why it's so important that the moon is so important in the Vedic system. And so when it's with Rahu, the person isn't really the way they experience their environment is so contrary to what most people would say, this is what your environment is. So they have a very skewed idea of what, of how to relate to the world.
And of who they are and how they want to relate to the world.
Right. Their reactions to what's going on around them seem completely inappropriate to others, because they have a very warped understanding of how to process what's happening to them in the outside world.
Right.
You know, they're kind of in their own world, I guess you could say. It doesn't make them, it's not a yoga for insanity. It doesn't make them insane. I don't want to give that impression, but it just, they're very different.
Right.
In how they process what's happening to them.
Yes. And they're very willing to be different, you know. I really see that, you know, when you talk to anybody, it's nice when you can see the person has a solid sense of a personality. You don't want it to be too solid, because then you can bump into people without being able to adapt. I think that the signification of Rahu here shows that there's almost a desire not to make a claim for this is who I am. You know, and this can be a for better or worse thing, because it's useful to have some sense of personality when you're trying to deal with people, when you're trying to talk to people, when you're trying to say that this is who I'm trying to become.
Right. Yeah, exactly. They don't really understand, you know, the way they react to things and the way they react to other people in their sphere of influence, their family, their friends, is off. In a way. It's odd. And
go ahead, Laura. Yeah, we can.
Well, another really interesting thing about this is when you have Moon in the 6th and Rahu in the 6th. So the 6th house has to do with enemies, overcoming problems, paying attention to details, work, hard work, all of those. But it's how when you have a benefic in the 6th house, especially the Moon, there's a part of the person that wants to make peace.
Right.
They want to smooth everything over and make peace, and they don't like a lot of conflict happening. But Rahu in the 6th is the opposite. Rahu in the 6th can develop a very vicious personality,
wanting to fix things, but through derision, through hard, malefic will.
They actually want to create enemies because Rahu is what we need to experience. It's where we're green. We don't have a lot of talent. We don't have a lot of experience. So we extrovert the energy. Rahu is, it pushes the energy of something outward.
It's like projects almost.
Right. Yeah. It projects energy outward. So what it does that, so the person can experience whatever it is that house or planet represents.
The reality of it.
Right. So it projects a very vicious, critical personality because it's in the 6th. The 6th is adversities, it's enemies, it's conflict. So it's going to project that conflictual part of the personality outward, and they can get a really bad reputation sometimes. Right. So he has both of these, and so he wavered between being very gentle and very caring and very nice, and then having this explosive anger. And if you read about him, people will say they just never could pinpoint what he was going to do. Right. It's a very common. He was going to react,
No kidding.
He was just.
He could be such a sweetheart in one moment, and really because he's trying to be good and adapt in a gentle way to the good things in life, because there are good things in the 6th house as well. But every house point is a duality. And if you're grasping for the good things, it must mean that you're trying to stay away from the bad things. And it's this avoidance and criticism of the bad things that Rahu would have amplified, although it would have also made a deep attachment probably to those good things. One of the reasons he hated the bad things so bad was because he loved the good things so good, shall we say.
Yeah, I know. I mean, and the moon is where we feel comfortable. So he felt comfortable with doing a lot of work. Obviously he was so prolific with his work, and he did a lot of it. So and just to for those watching, just to clarify a little bit, in Vedic astrology in general, it's common for us to consider the signs from the rising sign as well as the house cusp. Oh, right. I wanted to clarify that.
Thank you, Laura. Just for my audience, because some people get thrown off
this I'm not looking at it as equal sign, equal house. I'm looking at the cusp.
Right.
And that actually becomes really important for Rahu Ketu to look at the cusp that they're close, that they're conjoined in the sign with, rather than what sign they are from the ascendant.
No kidding. That makes total sense.
So that's why I'm talking about the 6th. I forgot.
Gotcha. Yep. Thank you for clarifying, Laura. I thought I would do that. Now, is there anything else that, this really clues us into the personal struggles that Picasso was facing internally as he was moving through what he was moving through in his life? Is there anything else you wanted to mention in terms of the moon here?
No, I think we can move on.
Yep. Okay. Now, I think one of the bigger themes, we're really building a picture of Picasso as a person who has a deep need to carve self-expression through the Leo rising, and having struggles there because of the nature of the sun. As well, there's a picture of a sort of not doomed, but really a very testy internal life, as we can see from this Rahu moon conjunction in the 6th house, or near the 6th house cusp, shall we say. Now, another big piece that we're building with our conversation on Picasso is what we would call this yoga between Saturn and Jupiter. This is where I'm thinking of moving now, Laura. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay.
Okay.
Alrighty. So I think our next topic of conversation is that we're moving towards Jupiter being conjunct Saturn in the 10th sign from the Lagna, where that 11th house cusp is, which I think is probably going to be predominant in the conversation that we're going to be having. Well, at least ultimately, once we get into Jaimini and these sorts of things. So now, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I want to start getting into the goods, but I did want to mention this. We can see that Jupiter, which is the 5th lord and the 8th lord, is with Saturn, which is the 6th and 7th lord of the chart. And these two are conjunct. Now, one of the things I wanted to say here is that really this Jupiter is having some struggles in terms of the Lajatati of Ashtas. The two big reasons is because Saturn is conjunct and therefore starving that Jupiter. And as well, Jupiter, by being in the sign of Taurus, is also being starved by Venus. Now, Jupiter does have a little bit of help from its friend, the sun. It's getting a little bit of a boost on its of a delight from the sun. That stops it from being absurdly drowned out. And ultimately, the Jupiter still has some pretty negative points on its Lajatati of Ashtas. So it's being starved pretty hard here. And as the 5th lord, that shows some struggle for Pablo Picasso to be able to wield his creativity, his romantic sense of falling organically and joyfully into the type of creativity that he would like to apply. One of the reasons I'm bringing this up is because we mentioned that at the beginning of Pablo Picasso's career, we can see that he had a loaded loaded card deck in terms of the fact that his father taught him to paint at a very early age. And he was really pushed in a lot of ways into a school that was a really epic academy for his time when he was sort of younger. He was studying very high-end art. And it's interesting to me that in the biography that I read, at this early age, when he was going to these high-end schools, he actually didn't care too much to study and to be a part of this really 10th house, exalted social status, exalted way of dealing with his art and way of dealing with business and way of expanding your potentials of life in general. All of these things were pushing him, which did launch him ultimately to become the great progressive person that he did later in his life and overall in his career. But early on, he actually spent a lot of time when he was going to this school. He spent a lot of time just hanging out with local artists at Prado, I believe is where he was, and checking out tiny little art exhibits and paying less attention to the schooling that his father was trying to push him through. And I believe that this is reflective of Saturn and Venus starving that creative Jupiter. Would you say that I'm kind of getting an accurate narrative there, Laura?
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
That really stuck out in my head when I was reading about Picasso's biography.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is what we would typically call Parashara gives some very specific combinations for these different types of yogas. This is considered to be a Raja Yoga. The reason I'm saying that is because Jupiter, a Raja Yoga is when you have an angular lord conjunct a trinal lord. The trines bring talent, the angles bring opportunity and, shall we say, necessity to deal with something. So the opportunity and the talent of Jupiter is being combined with the opportunity of the angular lord Saturn here.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is of course considered to be a very important and a crowning yoga in so many ways and so many readings. And what we always say is that it's important to qualify the nature of these yogas. Through Asheville Vedic Astrology, the big way that we learn to do this is a Parashara technique, is that we use Ishta, Sabha, Digbala. Is that something that you commonly use in your yoga qualifications, Laura?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Because what I noticed, if you don't mind, Laura, would you bring up a Ishta Sabha screen just so we can take a quick peek?
Did you want this one under the Logitati Avestas or?
I was thinking more of the Ishta Sabha option.
Right.
I think usually, I wonder if you'll be able to. Usually, I'll click on one of the tiny squares. I'll right click or whatever, and then I'll look for the
I see.
Ishta Sabha.
Oh yeah. Okay.
You got it. You got it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Laura. So what I wanted to point out is that really you want to have an even flow of Ishta, Sabha, and Digbala. The mathematical formula works out in Picasso's chart that there's more, the green 4 is greater than the red 2. We can see in Jupiter here. So this gives the ability to bring positive things out of this yoga. Now, Saturn is not quite the same. Saturn is going to be amplifying a lot of dirt and junk in this yoga because Saturn doesn't have quite the same Digbala strength. It's coming close to the first house cusp. It doesn't have the greatest Sabha either, and its Ishta is pretty average. So Saturn doesn't have the same opportunity to take advantage of this yoga that Jupiter does, but Jupiter is getting some of its creative capacity through Picasso's engagement with what Saturn represents in that 10th house. So really, there is something to be said for this yoga producing some good things, although it's generally stained in a certain way. Partly because Saturn rules the evil sixth house and Jupiter rules the evil eighth house. This Jupiter will get some good capacity to do the creative things that it wants to do, but it has to deal with the fact that it's attached to that unstable eighth house. Really, there's an unstable wavering with his capacity to create through Jupiter, and it brings antagonism through Saturn in that sixth house. So this is how I wanted to qualify this yoga a little bit, Laura. Now, I'm wondering what you might have to say and what you might think of everything that I've just laid down in terms of this yoga. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think that is a very powerful yoga.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're absolutely right. You know, the weight that he had to go through to actually become mature in his creative expression is very indicative of this Jupiter and Saturn conjunction in the 10th. And then, you know, the Saturn is the one that's the sixth house lord. So that's the evil house. And the eighth house is actually neutral, but it's still
Thank you for clarifying that, Laura. Thank you.
Yeah,
I appreciate you
well,
saying
it's going to give,
right.
you know, ups and downs, of course, or it's going to give a theme of eighth house themes to his art, which is pretty much his most famous painting is Guernica, which is about war.
Right.
About after the Basque village got bombed out by Germany.
Right.
So
we see there's the bull, and it's this animal thing that's inside the room, and it's kicking everything around, and it's very dramatic and chaotic.
Yeah, exactly. And it was about the bombing after war, which is an eighth house thing. Eighth house is war and battle.
Wow.
So, and then a lot of his art was very psychological and taboo, quote unquote. That's the eighth house rules taboo, as does Rahu.
And this brought instability, but it also that's part of the reason why we celebrate him as an avant-garde progressive artist, is because he was willing to go to those places.
Right. Exactly. He really did.
No kidding.
So it really does show very strongly the eighth house themes in this yoga. And the sixth house themes of delay, you know, being, you know, debt. And it was just mainly the delay. But when it did come, this is what happens with a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in general. But even having these strong yogas, it even is more prevalent in his chart. When the success did come, it came in a very big way.
Very solidly.
Yeah. And that's when you get Jupiter Saturn conjunctions, the first part of life is usually difficult. This is just generally speaking. Of course, these things can be qualified. You know, he has other named yogas in his chart that are pushing him towards fame, including some Jaimini yogas, which we'll talk about later. But generally speaking, as the person after the Saturn maturation, the person usually gets a lot of success.
So do you mean the Saturn return, or do you mean the Graha Saturn maturation? I believe around
the maturation, which is age 35.
Right. Okay. All right.
Yeah. There can be other things that make that more, you know, mitigate that, of course, but usually the person is kind of lost as to what their purpose is. Jupiter is purpose. Jupiter is dharma, or, you know, inspired action, inspired creation. And that Saturn is holding it up.
Right. But so we often if you don't mind me just bringing this point here, Laura, we often consider that Saturn is this drawing back planet. I often think of it as sort of like pulling the plunger of a pinball back. You know, you have to pull it back, right? Which is annoying. You know, for the first 35 years of most people's lives, we're all pulling that plunger back, which means that whatever is involved with Saturn is not going forward for a long time. It's being pulled back. But after you snap it, there's a momentum that Saturn creates because of its stabilizing influence, because Saturn causes us, through the experience of limitation, we feel like we're not getting enough. We're getting thirsty, or, maybe thirsty is not the right word, but we want the experience of what we're lacking through what's signified by Saturn in the first part of our lives. And it's the lack that delivers the desire to integrate once Saturn matures. And so this gave a great desire to mature and fully use that Jupiter once that Saturn became mature.
Yes, you're absolutely right. That's what happens just exponentially when you have Jupiter with Saturn. And the another thing too, just off the top of my head, I was just thinking of this, was he lived very long. He lived till 91.
Right.
And, he was a chain smoker, big drinker.
No kidding.
Yeah, but he still lived a long time, and Saturn is longevity. And Jupiter with Saturn is also retrograde, so he's even more powerful. He's extremely bright in the sky. So both of those planets are. So it really just gave him a lot of power after that Saturnian maturation and later in life.
No kidding. And Jupiter is really helping the Saturn, that planet of really endings. The end lasted a long time because Jupiter helped to sustain it in that way. And I might even think that, I wonder if there's an indication, since Jupiter is the 8th lord, maybe there was at some level a fastening of the vitalizing things that would keep him alive as he got older, because Saturn is stabilizing the 8th lord, Jupiter.
Right. Yes.
I'm wondering if I can make that claim as well.
Yes, definitely. Absolutely.
Very clarifying.
Yeah, it's what was I going to say? Jupiter is getting some help from his friends. He's getting help from the sun mainly. Really just the sun. When you look at these points down here, it should be anything over 40.
Right.
But
the moon's helping a little bit, but
yeah, it is.
The sun would be the bigger one.
And but overall, this is a really good yoga, and just for people who do have Jupiter Saturn conjunctions out there, they do actually search for their purpose and a philosophical platform or a spirituality to follow, but they usually don't have much success with it until later in life. Or, they're just kind of lost as to what their purpose is. But when they get older, they will work really hard to understand what their purpose is and to follow their purpose and integrate it into their life.
Right. And to really wear the badge.
Right. They really do work hard for that, because Saturn is that planet of focus and, pushing through adversity, getting through suffering. Saturn is our ability to withstand suffering. So, you'll notice these people, as they get older, they really come into their own. If it's not forming any intense yogas here like it is with Picasso's chart. So
very clarifying.
Yeah,
we can really see that in the end, Picasso did end up, through paintings like Guernica, he started to be more than just a painter of pretty pictures or even of interesting pictures. He started to include some consciousness, some ethic, some sense of being the journalist of the meaning of his times through his art, as he matured and got older.
Yeah, very true.
Now, Laura, is there anything else that you wanted to say in regards to this particular yoga?
Not about this yoga. I do want to say that I don't know if I'm getting, a little off the thing here, but I just want to bring up Jupiter
Sure.
because Jupiter is a Karaka of the Saptamsha Varga or the D7 Varga, which is a
Interesting.
Varga of the seventh house.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a really important chart in people who want an audience, like who want, because this is the chart of the seventh house rules the public.
Mm-hmm.
And so the public has to embrace you if you want to be famous or you want people to embrace your creations, like your art or music or whatever it is.
Right. And that's at like a real, like almost a person to person level where, it's like in marriage, you can marry someone for their money, but that doesn't mean you're going to like them, like aesthetically and like how they come off. This D7 chart is really, Picasso being received by the public.
Yeah, exactly. And the Jupiter is the most important planet here because it's the seventh, it's a derivative of the seventh house. And we usually associate that with Venus. This chart actually shows the happiness in relationships and the fulfillment you get from a relationship and from your spouse. It's not the Navamsha.
Clarifying.
But this one will show how the public embraces you as well. Okay. And your legacy, like how long your creations will last after you die. And
wonderful.
The thing is too, well, in his natal chart, the seventh house is ruled by Saturn, and Saturn is wonderful, phenomenal. Okay.
Yes.
So the public really embraced him. But Jupiter is the Karaka of this seventh because it rules the Swadhisthana chakra or the sexual chakra, and it's the creative principle. Jupiter rules children, which are creations, and the seventh house rules sex. So that it's very linked to that, and not Venus. Venus is in its own way, but Jupiter is the fifth planet. And this Varga is the fifth Varga in the Shodasha Varga scheme, which is Parashara's scheme. And he only names certain Vargas and he skips others. And this one is the fifth one, even though it's a derivative of the seventh house.
So there is a meshing of seventh house themes and fifth house children, creativity, etc.
Absolutely. Yep. Definitely.
Very clear.
Yeah. So when you want to look at creativity and how the public is going to react to it, you want to look at this chart in addition to relationships. Okay. Romantic relationships. So the Jupiter here is pretty good. I mean, it's in a friend sign. Okay. It's in the 9th from the ascendant.
Yep.
And it's joined the 11th house cusp, which is the house of gains.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Then the 7th house becomes really important in this chart because it's a D7 Varga. That's ruled by Saturn.
In natural 7th house from the Lagna.
Right. And yeah, exactly. And so Saturn is in its own sign of Capricorn.
All right.
Doing really well. So this shows that the public is going to embrace his creations quite strongly. And even Saturn is with the moon, which is the Karaka of the public. The moon rules the public.
Wow.
So
very clear.
Yeah, so this is really important to shine more of a magnifying glass on his popularity and fame.
Right.
And he also has a Jaimini yoga for fame, which we'll talk about later. But
of course.
I just wanted to point this out because this is Parashara, the Vargas.
Very good, Laura. And I think the only thing I wanted to add to this, and it's something that I did almost forget to mention it, is that I noticed that Saturn in this natal chart in general is hugely delighted in the Lajatati of Ashtas. That's one thing that that I forgot to mention. Saturn is delighted from its friend Venus by being in the sign of Taurus, and it's delighted by Jupiter. Anyone being conjunct to Jupiter is going to bring huge delight. Yeah. So really, there is a deep capacity for Picasso to be regarded by the public as that seventh lord, as well as being the seventh in the D7. This Saturn has great regard for the public around it at the time, and really kind of like eternally in this sort of way. Because this Saturn is well placed in the D7, not only is this Saturn have such delight, it has a capacity to understand the needs and wants of people in general, like of humanity in general. And I think that by the placement in the D7, this shows that this Saturn having this delight is going to really probably stand the test of time, because of its position in the D7. This is kind of what my brain is just sort of taking me to, Laura. Does that make sense as I've described it?
Definitely. Absolutely.
Very cool. Very clear.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, now, Laura. So we've given this a pretty good picture of the Parashara side of things. And as usual, as it rolls with me, I actually, you know, what's funny? I haven't mentioned this yet. I have a very similar chart to Pablo Picasso. I'm Leo rising.
Oh, really?
Yep. Leo rising, sun in Scorpio, and the moon in Sagittarius.
Oh, wow.
Totally. And I'm excited to be talking about it. So
Oh,
what I wanted to say is,
yeah.
at the risk of letting my Sagittarius moon take us too scattered right at the beginning, I'd like to offer you, Laura, now the opportunity to let us know. I believe you also had some named yogas that you might have wanted to mention, and from there,
yeah.
you can feel free to unfold.
Yeah, he's got a few. All of these yogas. Well, this deceit yoga isn't a great one, but that's a very common one. A lot of people have this.
Like me.
Yeah, I think I do too. It's not that rare. So
of course.
But it's just basically being in touch with your feelings and acting on the foundational of the fourth house, your emotional foundation.
Even if you come off malefic to people, which is, it has to, because you've got that malefic that needs to express itself, and it has to express through the fourth house, which causes that heat that we mentioned.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, that's kind of a common, I think it's more or less common, but then he's got the Buddha Aditya yoga, which I already mentioned, but then he's got some of these Raja King yogas, which completely makes sense. You know, a very imaginative, optimistic mentality. That's Jupiter in the 10th and the moon in the 5th.
Interesting. That's a big one. That's a huge one.
This is a really strong one that will give him that power.
Certainly.
Yeah. And then this one is Shankya conch shell yoga. And this is when the 5th and 6th lord are in mutual angles and support self-employment or authority and rids the native of performance of service. That makes sense.
Right. Now, I wonder if this is referring to the Saturn and Jupiter conjunction. The 5th lord Jupiter and the 6th lord Saturn. Is that what's being
Yep. And they're in an angle. I mean, they're conjoined. They're in the first house from each other. So yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So he has some really nice named yogas that manifested during his life.
Very good. And this is, of course, for everybody watching, this is all stuff that you can learn from the Parashara dimension of astrology.
Right. Yeah. Now, all of those yogas that I just mentioned, they're all in Parashara.
So these are all things that, for everybody watching, this is all stuff that is the basic foundational chopping block of Asheville Vedic Astrology, which my audience knows that is the main schooling that I took to get where I am in my present state on YouTube. So now, Laura, I invite you can take the reins here, and you can rock and roll and let us know everything that you think about Jaimini. Now, we've already taken a lot of time, Laura. I don't know